There is a quiet kind of damage that happens when someone never apologizes. A damage that doesn't always look dramatic on the surface, but slowly rewires the emotional world of everyone involved. Because an apology is not just a word, it is a signal to the human nervous system that safety is being restored, that trust can begin again, that pain has been acknowledged. And when that signal never comes, confusion replaces clarity, resentment replaces peace, and relationships begin to deteriorate without anyone fully understanding why. And at first, you might not even recognize the pattern, because people who never apologize rarely appear cruel at the beginning. They often seem confident, strong-minded, decisive, even admirable in their certainty. They speak with authority. They stand their ground. They project the image of someone who knows exactly who they are, and it can be intoxicating to be around someone who seems so sure of themselves. But over time, small moments begin to add up. A comment that stings, followed by laughter instead of accountability. A mistake that somehow becomes your fault. An argument where the story is always rewritten in their favor. And you notice something strange. No matter how clear the harm, no matter how obvious the misunderstanding, the words "I'm sorry" never appear. And the absence of those words begins to feel louder than any insult, because your brain is wired for emotional repair. When hurt happens, the mind expects acknowledgement, and when that acknowledgement is repeatedly denied, the discomfort does not disappear, it accumulates. And with each unspoken apology, a silent fracture forms in the relationship. And yet the person who refuses to apologize often seems completely unaware of this emotional erosion. Because in their internal world, the story is always filtered through self-protection. They remember the fight, but not the pain they caused. They recall the accusation, but not the wound behind it. They focus on being misunderstood rather than on what they misunderstood in others. And this is where the true psychology begins to reveal itself. Because most people assume that those who never apologize are driven purely by arrogance or ego. But in reality, the refusal to apologize is rarely about superiority. It is usually about vulnerability, fear, and survival strategies that took root long before adulthood. For some, admitting fault feels dangerous because it once led to punishment rather than forgiveness. For others, it feels unbearable because their identity was built on perfection and control. And for many, it threatens a fragile self-image that cannot tolerate imperfection without collapsing into shame. And so the mind quietly learns a rule that feels logical to the nervous system, even if it is destructive to relationships. Never admit you are wrong, never show weakness, never surrender control, and once this rule is internalized, it becomes automatic. The person no longer chooses to avoid apologies, their brain simply reacts before reflection can take place. Defense rises faster than empathy. Justification arrives before accountability. And over time, this reflex becomes their default personality. And what makes this pattern so powerful is that it does not feel like a lie to them. Their memory reshapes events just enough to keep them innocent. Their perception bends reality in subtle ways that protect their identity. And they genuinely experience themselves as the victim in most conflicts, which is why confronting them often feels impossible. Because you are not just questioning their behavior, you are threatening the psychological architecture that holds their sense of self together. And when that structure is threatened, the response is not reflection, but resistance. Anger, denial, or emotional shutdown. And so the cycle continues unabated. Loved ones grow tired. Conversations grow shorter. Emotional depth fades. But still, the non-apologizer feels misunderstood rather than responsible, isolated rather than accountable. And this is how relationships die slowly, without clear endings. Not through violence or betrayal, but through the steady absence of repair. And yet the most tragic part of this psychology is not the damage it causes to others. It is what it does to the person themselves. Because when you never apologize, you never fully process guilt. And guilt is not an enemy emotion. It is a moral signal that guides growth. Without it, the personality becomes rigid, defensive, and emotionally stagnant. Unable to evolve, because evolution requires the humility to say, "I was wrong," and this stagnation creates a paradoxical life experience where the person appears strong yet feels perpetually attacked, appears confident yet feels perpetually defensive, appears independent yet feels perpetually misunderstood. And as the years pass, this internal tension often hardens into bitterness, a subtle hostility toward the world that never seems to treat them fairly. And they may never connect this bitterness to the absence of apology in their life, because from their perspective, the problem has always been other people, never themselves. And this illusion can persist for decades, shaping marriages, families, workplaces, and friendships without ever being named. And those closest to them often oscillate between self-doubt and emotional exhaustion, wondering if they themselves are too sensitive, too demanding, too dramatic, because repeated denial of another's pain slowly conditions the victim to question their own reality. And this is why the refusal to apologize is not just a personality flaw. It is a relational injury that quietly destabilizes the emotional ground beneath everyone involved. And yet, despite its destructive power, this behavior is rarely born from malice. It is born from unhealed psychological wounds, from environments where accountability was replaced with fear, where emotional safety never existed, where being wrong meant being unloved, and the adult who emerges from that environment does not consciously choose this pattern. They inherit it, and like all inherited psychological patterns, it feels like truth rather than trauma. And this is what makes the mind of a person who never apologizes so complex and so difficult to reach, because you are not dealing with a simple refusal of a word. You are standing at the edge of a deeply defended inner world where vulnerability has always been dangerous and control has always felt like survival. To truly understand the psychology of a person who never apologizes, you have to step inside a mind that is constantly scanning for threat, even in ordinary human interactions. Because at the core of this behavior is not confidence, but hyper-defensiveness, a nervous system trained to interpret accountability as danger. And from the outside, this person may look calm, composed, even dominant in conflict. But internally, their emotional world is tense, rigid, and constantly braced for attack, because for them, being wrong does not feel like a simple mistake. It feels like exposure, humiliation, and potential rejection all at once. And so their mind performs a rapid protective maneuver the moment guilt begins to rise, shifting blame, rewriting memory, minimizing harm, or reframing themselves as the real victim. And this happens so fast that they genuinely believe their own version of events, which is why arguing with a non-apologizer feels like debating a moving target. The facts shift, the context changes, and suddenly the original harm disappears beneath layers of justification. And over time, this becomes an unconscious survival mechanism rather than a conscious choice. Because in many cases, this pattern was formed very early in life, in households where mistakes were punished harshly, where love was conditional, where admitting fault meant losing safety rather than gaining understanding, and a child raised in such an environment learns a brutal lesson. Survival depends on never being wrong, and that lesson does not dissolve with age. It matures into an adult personality that equates apology with danger, weakness, and loss of power. And so the adult builds an identity around being right, being strong, being untouchable, not realizing that what they call strength is actually a fortress built around unprocessed fear. And because that fortress keeps shame out, it also keeps empathy from fully entering. And this is why many people who never apologize struggle deeply with emotional attunement. They can understand others intellectually, but have difficulty feeling the emotional weight of another person's pain, because to feel it fully would require acknowledging their role in causing it. And that acknowledgement would threaten the stability of their self-image. And so their empathy becomes selective, offered only in situations where they are not implicated, but withdrawn in moments where responsibility would be required. And this creates a strange, emotional contradiction where they may appear caring in general, but cold when it matters most, and the people closest to them feel this most painfully. Because intimacy naturally increases the chances of emotional injury, and every unacknowledged injury becomes another silent wedge between them and others. Yet the non-apologizer often experiences these relational fractures as mysterious betrayals, distance that came out of nowhere, coldness that doesn't make sense, and resentment that feels unfair because their mind edits out the one consistent variable: their refusal to repair. And psychologically, this creates a closed loop where every consequence of their behavior is experienced as proof of their innocence rather than as feedback for growth. And as this loop continues over years, it reshapes the person's emotional reality. They begin to see the world as filled with unreasonable people, overly sensitive partners, disloyal friends, incompetent co-workers, and ungrateful family members. And this worldview reinforces their defensive posture, making apology feel even more unnecessary and even more dangerous. And yet, beneath all of this defense, there is often a quiet, unspoken fear that is almost never visible on the surface. The fear of being unlovable if imperfect, the fear of being abandoned if flawed, the fear of being exposed as inadequate. And because these fears are too painful to feel directly, they are buried beneath layers of rationalization and control. And this is why many non-apologizers appear emotionally rigid. They must maintain control at all costs, because control is what keeps the deeper fear out of conscious awareness. And when someone asks them to apologize, it is not heard as a request for healing, but as an attempt to dismantle their armor. And that is why the reaction is often disproportionate to the situation. A small request triggers a large defensive response: anger where calm would suffice, silence where dialogue would heal, and withdrawal where connection is needed. And over time, this pattern trains the people around them to walk on eggshells, to suppress their own hurt, to minimize their own needs, to choose peace over truth. And slowly, the emotional ecosystem around the non-apologizer becomes distorted, because relationships cannot survive long without reciprocity of accountability. One person cannot forever carry the burden of repair, and yet the non-apologizer often feels exhausted, emotionally drained, and misunderstood, unaware that much of their exhaustion comes from the energy it takes to maintain constant psychological defense, to guard every interaction, to scan every conversation for threat, to protect the self-image at all costs. And this is the hidden tragedy of this mindset. It demands immense emotional labor while giving the illusion of strength. But the strength is brittle because it depends on never being wrong, and life is guaranteed to prove everyone wrong again and again. And so the person who never apologizes is locked in a lifelong struggle against reality itself, fighting the natural human process of error and repair. And while they may appear powerful in individual conflicts across the span of a lifetime, they often lose something far more valuable than winning or losing arguments. They lose depth, softness, emotional safety, and the quiet relief that comes from knowing you can be imperfect and still be loved. The true cost of never apologizing is rarely paid in dramatic moments of confrontation. It is paid quietly over years through emotional erosion, through relationships that slowly lose warmth, through friendships that fade without clear explanations, through marriages that grow emotionally distant without obvious betrayals, and through families where conversations become polite but hollow, because when harm is never repaired, it does not disappear. It settles into the emotional background like invisible dust, accumulating silently until the air itself feels heavy. And what makes this cost so devastating is that the non-apologizer often does not connect their loneliness to their behavior. They experience isolation as something the world has done to them, rather than something that has grown around them, and so they may reach middle age, surrounded by people, yet deeply alone, respected, perhaps even feared, but not truly trusted or emotionally known. And the tragedy is that many of them sense this emptiness without understanding its source. They feel a vague dissatisfaction in relationships, a recurring pattern of conflicts that never fully resolve, a constant sense of being misunderstood, and yet they still tell themselves the same story they have always told. That others are too sensitive, too demanding, too dramatic, too unfair, and this narrative preserves the ego but starves the heart, because the human heart is not nourished by being right, it is nourished by being connected, and connection is impossible without repair, and repair is impossible without apology. And when this cycle is broken for decades, the personality itself begins to harden. Emotional flexibility declines, curiosity about one's own faults disappears, and the person becomes increasingly certain and increasingly alone, at the same time, a psychological state that feels stable on the surface, but is quietly consuming the capacity for joy beneath it. Yet the most painful consequence is not the loss of others, it is the loss of self-awareness. Because to never apologize is to live in a carefully edited version of reality, where personal mistakes are erased from consciousness. And when mistakes are erased, so is growth. The person remains psychologically stuck at the age where the defense pattern was first formed, repeating the same emotional behaviors decade after decade, wondering why the same problems keep returning with different faces. And this repetition creates a subtle kind of despair, a sense that life is always unfair, always difficult, always disappointing, without realizing that unresolved emotional debt weighs down every new beginning. And yet, despite how entrenched this pattern can become, the human psyche is never truly finished. Even the most rigid defense can crack under the right conditions. And the path out of this psychological prison does not begin with humiliation or punishment. It begins with awareness. With that rare and terrifying moment when a person dares to look at their own life honestly and notices the pattern beneath the surface of events. The repeated conflicts, the repeated emotional distances, the repeated sense of being misunderstood. And instead of constructing another justification, they pause long enough to ask a radically uncomfortable question. What if I am part of this? And that question, simple as it sounds, is often the most revolutionary moment in the inner life of a non-apologizer, because it creates a crack in the fortress of identity where reflection can finally enter. And this reflection is rarely gentle. It often arrives as grief for relationships lost, regret for moments that cannot be repaired, and a painful awareness of how fear disguised itself as strength for so long. And this is why many people avoid this step for an entire lifetime. Because the emotional cost of awareness feels unbearable at first, yet those who walk through it often describe it as the moment their life truly began, because once the fear of imperfection is faced rather than avoided, the need for constant defense begins to soften. The nervous system slowly learns a new truth, that admitting fault does not lead to annihilation, that vulnerability does not automatically result in rejection, that being wrong does not mean being unworthy, and learning this truth at an emotional level is the real work of healing. Because intellectual understanding alone is not enough to undo a lifetime of defensive conditioning. And this is why many who break this pattern require long periods of reflection, therapy, or profound life experiences that shake their rigid self-image. Experiences that finally force the ego to loosen its grip and allow the deeper self to emerge. And when this happens, something remarkable begins to change in their emotional world. Guilt is no longer experienced as a threat, but as information. Shame no longer dominates the identity, but becomes a passing feeling. An apology, once terrifying, begins to feel strangely liberating, because an apology is not just the admission of fault. It is the release of emotional tension that has been held inside for years, sometimes for decades. And those who finally learn to apologize often describe an unexpected lightness afterward, as if a weight they did not even know they were carrying has suddenly fallen away. And this lightness transforms relationships in subtle but profound ways. Arguments become shorter because repair is no longer postponed. Trust deepens because accountability is no longer avoided. And intimacy becomes safer because emotional honesty is no longer a threat. And most importantly, the person begins to relate to themselves differently. No longer as a flawless image that must be protected at all costs, but as a human being allowed to be imperfect and still worthy of love. And this shift in self-relationship is the true endpoint of healing, because when a person learns to apologize, they are not just repairing bridges to others. They are repairing the fractured relationship between their ego and their humanity. And in the end, this is the strange paradox of the psychology of people who never apologize. What they fear most is not being wrong. It is being unlovable if wrong. And once that fear is healed, the word sorry no longer feels like a weapon turned inward. It becomes what it was always meant to be, a doorway back to connection, truth, and emotional freedom.